This week we're going to talk about reptiles, and reptiles are cold-blooded animals. The word reptile means to creep, and cold-blooded means that they regulate their body temperature according to external factors. This is why many times you'll see reptiles or snakes or various other cold-blooded animals out on a rock in the sun in order to increase their body temperature. And this is also why in the colder climates and colder times you really don't see these animals around very much because they can't function in the cold weather. The technical word for this is poikiotherms, and this just means that the external temperature or environmental temperature controls the fluctuations of body temperature. What are the similarities or characteristics that define a reptile? First of all, they're vertebrates, so they're part of the phylum Vertebrata. They are poikiotherms or cold-blooded. They, as a group, have dry, tough skin, and they have scales. And they do something that a lot of other animals do not do, which is as they grow or over time, they will shed their outer skin. And this shedding process is known as molting. They are generally tetrapods, and they have claws. They have lungs much like we do. And they have a three-chambered heart. Now this means that the two sides of the circulation, that is the systemic side and the pulmonary side, are now commingled. They are not separate. And this is important. They are oviparous, which means they are egg layers, and much like birds, they lay very similar kinds of eggs. And some of them, a small group of them, can also have an egg which hatches internally and then the young is born alive. Now this is called ovoviviparous. Lizards are the first group we'll talk about, and they are the most numerous of the reptiles. They live in various habitats, most commonly in the tropical regions, but are also found in virtually any region except probably the polar areas. They vary in size from a tiny size to an enormous size, the Komodo lizard being an example of an enormous lizard. There are venomous lizards. Actually, there are only a couple of venomous lizards. One is the Gila monster, and the other is the Mexican beaded lizard. They tend to be very colorful creatures. They also, sometimes their coloration is used as a means of defense. And the chameleon is unique in the fact that it can change its color to blend into the background. Another means of defense is a detaching tail. A predator will come up and grab them by the tail and end up that's all they're holding on to is the lizard's tail. Some other unusual defenses are listed here. The chuckwalla, it hides within the rocks, and then if confronted by a predator, it will inflate its body in such a way that it cannot be pulled out of the rocks. The flying dragon can fly to get away. The frilled lizard stands on its high legs and frills a bonnet around its head and makes it look exceedingly bigger than it actually is, and frequently scares the predator off. And lastly, the horned lizard squirts blood from its eyes, and this frequently will run off a predator that's trying to attack it. The eating habits, most lizards eat insects. A few live on on plants and are herbivores. The second group we'll talk about are snakes. Blind snake is one of the smallest snakes and is so named because it cannot see. The python and the anaconda are the largest of the snakes, and we'll talk about different kinds of snakes, and these two snakes are both constrictors, and I'll explain that in more detail on a future slide. The snakes move by various means, and I'll show you an example of each one in the next slide. One means is called a lateral undulation, which is the snake will put its body in a series of curves, and then each curve pushes up against something in the path, like a rock or a plant, and this propels the snake forward. The second is called rectilinear movement, in which the snake lengthens and stretches and then shortens segments of the body. The third is concertina movement, where the snake moves the front half of its body forward, anchors it, and then pulls up the back half behind it. And then lastly, an unusual form is called sidewinding, where there are 4 or 5 anchor points on the body and the snake actually moves sideways. So on the left is an example of the lateral undulation, and you can see that each of these curves can press up against a part of the path here and move the snake forward. This is the rectilinear movement. This is the concertina movement, where the snake anchors its head, then pulls up its tail, then extends its head again, and much like a slinky. And then lastly, over here we see the sidewinder movement. The snake has scale-covered eyes. These are not exactly the same as the nictitating membrane, but are very similar. It allows the eyes to be open and protects the eyes from dust, and also takes advantage of the snake has no eyelids, and so there has to be a scale there to protect the eyes from dirt and dust and various other things that can get in the eye. The eyes are wide set on the head, and the snake, for this reason, has excellent peripheral vision. The snake can also, contrary to popular belief, the snake can also hear, and it hears without ears, and it interprets vibrations, and it probably doesn't hear the way we think about hearing, but in a sense it is a form of hearing. And the way that it hears is partly by using the quadrate bone. The quadrate bone is a bone that's loosely attached to the jaw and skull, and this transmits sound to the central nervous system. Snakes have a fairly exquisite sense of smell. The sense of smell is primarily the Jacobson organ, and the way it works is, if you see the Jacobson organ is right here, and the snake flicks out its tongue and waves it, and what that does is sends smell or particles toward this Jacobson organ, and it detects that as a smell. And so when you see a snake doing that, it's trying to pick up the smells in the area around it. The snake is designed to eat things whole. They don't chew anything. They have a double-hinged jaw, and if you've ever watched a snake eat, either on film or maybe you've owned a snake, it can open its mouth extremely wide and engulf a meal that many times is bigger than its head. And one of the most interesting films I've ever seen was this snake come up and it ate an egg, and the egg is literally 3 times as big as the snake's head. And then it engulfs it whole without chewing. People who study snakes are called herpetologists, and as I mentioned, there are blind snakes which are totally harmless. They have no eyes and they look like worms. The first family of snakes is called the Boyd family. The Boyd family is non-venomous, ovoviviparous, which means it lays an egg internally in its body and then hatches, and then that snake is expelled live. And these snakes kill by constriction. Constrictors kill their prey by wrapping themselves around the prey, and every time the prey takes a breath out, it tightens to the point where the animal or prey can no longer take a breath in and it suffocates. Now, pythons are different than the rest of the boyd snakes in the fact that they lay eggs. Now, the other groups of snakes are listed here. Colubrids are generally harmless snakes, with a few being venomous, but most are not. And this is like a black snake as an example. They are important because wherever they are, they get rid of rodents and mice. That's what they eat. They have fangs, which those that have venom can inject venom with, and then they grab and inject the venom in the prey, and the prey dies, and then they eat it. Illipids are venomous snakes with fangs and venom glands. And these are snakes that you probably never run into, like the cobra, which is primarily in Asia, and the mamba, which is primarily in Africa. And then there's viperids, which are venomous snakes that live in more temperate climates. An example of that is the pit viper. And the pit viper has a pit, which is over here in this picture, which is sensitive to heat. And it can detect changes in heat, and in that way it can hone in on a prey without necessarily seeing it. There are two general kinds of snake venom. The first kind is a neurotoxin. The neurotoxin is actually the more dangerous of the two types of snake venom. It attacks the nervous system and causes stinging, pain, and eventually paralysis and death. Cobras, for example, have a neurotoxin. Coral snakes have a neurotoxin. The other is a hemotoxin, which damages the blood vessels and destroys blood cells. And this is the more common toxin, like snakes in Kentucky, for example. Neurotoxin, there really isn't a lot of neurotoxin antivenom available. There is antivenom for hematotoxin, and actually one of the premier places in the world to get antivenom is in Kentucky, outside of Red River Gorge. Snakebite treatment is fairly simple. The patient's made calm. There's an attempt to remove as much toxin as possible, and then antitoxins are used.